It's such a joy to be here in Lincoln. It's true, I've been here multiple times before. I have stopped here for more than just a night in a hotel before, but this is my first time to really meet people in Lincoln. We've had many alumni from the Emmaus Institute, some of whom are here this morning. I'm very grateful to see you all. Many students from Lincoln, many wonderful priests who've participated in the work of the Augustine Institute and also the School Sisters of Christ the King. And so it feels like a little bit of a home away from home. So great to be here. I hope to be back, and I hope to send many of my colleagues back here in months and years to come. So my title here is that they may be consecrated in truth, in appreciation of the Pontificate of Benedict XVI. On Holy Thursday, having washed his disciples' feet and instituted the Holy Sacrifice, Jesus prayed to the Father that he would sanctify them in the truth, explaining his prayer in these terms: "Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. And for their sake I consecrate myself, that they also may be consecrated in truth." St. Paul pointed to this consecration in the first line of his epistle to the Romans, when he described himself as set apart for the gospel of God. Set apart for the gospel of God. St. John echoed him when he anchored Christian identity in the imitation of Christ. I quote, this is from 1 John 2. "Whoever says he abides in him, in Christ, ought to walk in the same way that he walked." To imitate Jesus Christ and to obey his commandments is to be consecrated in the truth, to be set apart in the truth. This consecration was lived with great fidelity by the late Pope Benedict XVI. Although the word truth might spring to mind as a way of capturing the pontificate of his predecessor, the philosopher Pope John Paul II, I want to argue that it's also a fitting way of capturing the pontifical teaching of Benedict XVI. Okay? We might think that Benedict, the Augustinian Pope, with his first encyclical on love, is better captured by the word love, and we can have a friendly argument about that in a little while. But here are three considerations why truth is a good way into his pontificate. Okay? First, in a post-retirement interview, he summed up his pontificate retrospectively in these terms. I quote, "The important thing is that the faith endures today." I see that as the central task. Okay, so Peter Seewald had said, okay, all these things that you did as Pope, this and this and this, what was the most important thing? In his response, here was the central thing, that the faith should endure. Second, when he was invited to speak at the University of Rome, an invitation that the university at the last minute canceled, making Benedict the first victim of woke culture way back in 2011. Okay, he was canceled. He declared, so he had written the speech, okay, so then it's subsequently published. He declared, "It is the Pope's task to safeguard sensibility to the truth." Right? This is there on the handout. It's the Pope's task to safeguard sensibility to the truth, to invite reason to set out ever anew in search of what is true and good, in search of God, to urge reason to recognize Jesus Christ as the light. With this statement, he was reaching back to John Paul II's Fides et Ratio, an encyclical which he had helped to write, and putting truth right at the heart of his pontificate. Third is the well-known passage from the homily he delivered on April 18th, just a few days after the death of John Paul II, during the Mass for the election of the Roman Pontiff. And it's the second selection here on the handout, on this famous passage about the dictatorship of relativism. Okay? I quote, "Today, having a clear faith based on the creed of the Church is often labeled as fundamentalism, whereas relativism seems the only attitude that can cope with modern times. We are building a dictatorship of relativism that does not recognize anything as definitive and whose ultimate goal consists solely of one's own ego and desires. We, however, have a different goal. The Son of God, the true man, he is the measure of true humanism. An adult faith is not a faith that follows the trends of fashion and the latest novelty. A mature adult faith is deeply rooted in friendship with Christ. It is this friendship that opens up to us all that is good and gives us a criterion by which to distinguish the true from the false and deceit from truth." Okay, so our culture is a dictatorship of relativism. That's a wonderful little irony there, isn't it, right? You would think that relativism is sort of free and easy. But of course, as we know, that's not really the case. Okay? And in our friendship with Christ, we have the beacon or the standard for truth. These are the terms of engagement. On the eve of his election, it's precisely this speech that people think got him elected. Okay? And that seems right. And it's this speech that set the agenda for his pontificate. Okay? Well, there's nothing at all strange in associating the gospel of Jesus Christ with truth. Okay, there's nothing odd about that. To do so, however, does raise a practical difficulty for those who would proclaim the gospel because our age is not well disposed to truth. Now, we know this from our everyday experiences. Sadly, too, here in America, over the last couple of years, we've had a kind of pandemic against truth, if you will, right? We've had a kind of public culture arising that puts truth at arm's length in new and quite alarming ways. Okay? How does one work to preserve or safeguard a sensibility to truth in an age which is opposed to truth? How does one row upwards against a current like that? Here's an indication from the man who is, I think, the greatest living Catholic philosopher writing in the English language, Alistair MacIntyre. Okay, it's the third paragraph on the front of your handout here. MacIntyre's kind of a tough writer here, so I thought it'd be good for you to be able to follow along here as I read what MacIntyre has to say. He's talking about the role of what he calls a theistic philosopher in a secularized culture, but the same task is there for anyone who would promote the truth in our culture today. Okay, so for theistic philosopher, you can insert priest or bishop or sister or lay faithful. Since in the dominant culture there is available no shared impersonal standard by appeal to which disagreements might be rationally adjudicated, they are in fact resolved, if at all, by some form of non-rational persuasion. Okay, this is what happens in a culture of relativism because arguments aren't being made in public. It's slogans or images or other appeals to authority that tend to move people to adopt a certain point of view, right? This is, of course, again, this is what we've experienced so strikingly over the past 3 years with slogans like flatten the curve and follow the science and so forth, right? There was something reasonable about saying these things in certain contexts in a measured way, but I think as we know, they weren't given to us in a measured way. They were given to us for us to sort of bow down to as authoritative. Okay. Non-rational persuasion. What then are the tasks of a theistic philosopher who inhabits a culture like this, our present culture? Some of those tasks would, of course, be what they've always been. Okay, patiently to just keep on making arguments no matter whether people are listening. Just got to keep doing it. Okay? But now we have to make ourselves more aware than we have been of the difficulty in framing the terms of the debate in the current intellectual climate. We have to remain good listeners who are responsive to our critics, but not make ourselves into victims of those critics. Instead, we need to redirect the debates by focusing on the philosophical presuppositions of our critics and making them the matter for debate. We have to portray accurately and sympathetically the secular and secularizing cast of mind so that we can exhibit ruthlessly the distortions, the weaknesses, the moral, scientific, and metaphysical vulnerabilities of that secular cast of mind. Okay, so this is Alistair MacIntyre, writing about a decade ago as a Catholic philosopher, saying, right, we're going to have to go on the offensive. We're going to have to show the weaknesses of the secular cast of mind. Okay? Why is that a good strategy, right? Well, if you're addressing a culture that seems to be impervious to argument, seems to be not interested in truth claims, the way to get that culture's attention is by an attack, because then they're thrown on their heels, they're defensive, and they might recognize that they need to make arguments just to defend their own position. Okay, I think it's a brilliant point. It's an obvious enough point, perhaps, but it turns out, at least this is my conviction, that this is exactly what we see in the Pontificate of Benedict XVI. His major encyclicals, including the last one that he wrote and that Pope Francis published under his name, okay, were organized according to the theological virtues, right? Deus Caritas Est, God is love, 2005. Spe Salvi, by hope we are saved, 2007. And then the last one, Lumen Fidei, 2013, the light of faith, published under Francis's name. With that remaining encyclical, Caritas in Veritate, Charity in Truth, 2009, only underscoring these two themes: theological virtues, truth. Okay, so 3 encyclicals in sort of reverse order: love, hope, faith. A 4th encyclical, Love in Truth. Here's the pontificate: theological virtues and truth. Okay. As we consider, what I'm going to do is flip the order here. I'm going to go faith, hope, charity, rather than following a chronological order of his pontificate. We're going to consider what he has to say about faith, hope, and charity, and I want to do 2 things. Okay. First, I want to consider how Benedict set the truth of that is contained in the theological virtue, if you will, against the prevailing secular culture. So how he went on the attack. And then second, how he put the theological virtue on display for his Catholic audience, right? Because as a pope, he's got both the whole world as his audience and the church, right? So for the whole world, he goes on attack against the secular point of view. And for the church, what he does is he puts the beauty and the truth of the theological virtue on display to illuminate and to inspire the faithful. Okay? So this is how I'm going to try to carve up a very complicated and productive 8-year pontificate: faith, hope, charity, truth. Okay. All right. So first, faith in Christ and sensibility to the truth. Faith, as the Catechism puts it, is first of all a personal adherence of man to God. At the same time, and inseparably, it is a free assent to the whole truth that God has revealed. So it's Catechism, paragraph 150. Faith is a personal adherence of man to God. This is bringing to mind the role of the will in the act of faith, right? And it's a free assent to the whole truth that God has revealed. This is where the actual illumination of faith is located, right, in our intellect. Now, what God has revealed is nothing less than the mystery of his own divine being and of his love for us made manifest in Jesus Christ. This mystery illuminates all reality. As witnessed a line from Vatican II that St. John Paul II never tired of repeating, I quote, "Only in the mystery of the incarnate Word does the mystery of man take on light." We can say with great conviction with the psalmist, "In your light we see light." Right? So faith gives us the absolutely superior illumination on what really matters about our lives. Right? The question of who is man, who is God, how does God relate to man? Faith illuminates this area, because this is what's most important in the universe. Okay? Faith gives us a tremendous confidence about how to exercise our God-given faculty of reason. Consider how the Church declares to the world what the purpose of reason is. I'm going to quote again from the Catechism, from what I take to be one of the most significant paragraphs in the Catechism, paragraph 36. I think it's kind of a minor miracle that it made it into the Catechism, which is true for several different paragraphs over the length of the Catechism. But this is a big one. Paragraph 36 of the Catechism. Our Holy Mother, the Church, the paragraph begins by quoting the Acts of the First Vatican Council from 1871. Our Holy Mother, the Church, holds and teaches that God, the first principle and last end of all things, can be known with certainty from the created world by the natural light of human reason. And then the Catechism continues. Without this capacity, man would not be able to welcome God's revelation. Man has this capacity because he is created in the image of God. Okay, so the Church teaches that Catholics are to hold as a matter of faith that reason can attain knowledge of God, knowledge that God exists, and a few other pieces of knowledge about God, if you will, just by exercising reason correctly, okay, by the natural light of reason. So this is how to take this, right? This is, as it were, the Church declaring to the human race what your mind is for. Okay? Your mind is to allow you to attain knowledge of God. And it's because you have a mind that can do that, that it's suitable that God has revealed himself to you. Right? And of course, that's a superior illumination. God's self-revelation. But it's precisely because you have a mind that's suited to know God that he should have spoken to you. Well, whatever else we're going to say about a secular culture, it's clear that our secular culture refuses to seek the knowledge of God as the first principle and last end of all that exists. Now, there's nothing new in a stance of indifference to truth. Consider what the psalmist said here, Psalm 14. The Lord looks down from heaven on the children of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one. Psalm 14. Right? That psalm actually begins, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. Okay? But it's that lines 2 and 3, verses 2 and 3 of that psalm, The Lord looks down to see whether there's anyone who's looking back for him, who's looking for him, right? So it's a live possibility ever since the fall, right, to ignore God, not to look for him. There's nothing new about modern secularism. It's actually very old. It's just sinful man going his own way. We Catholics, we believers, we blessed believers, right? We should not be surprised or intimidated by secular indifference to the truth. It's an old story, not a new story. And Benedict XVI was in no way deterred or daunted by what he found in secular culture. In 3 major public addresses given to secular audiences, Benedict XVI named the error of secular indifference to truth and put its incoherence on display. This is him going on attack. Okay. In the speech he wrote for the University of Rome, he warned of the danger for the Western world that, quote, man will fail to face up to the question of truth. This would mean at the same time that reason would ultimately bow to the pressure of interests and the attraction of utility, constrained to recognize this as the ultimate criterion, utility as the ultimate criterion, close quotation. This is indeed a danger. If the measure of truth is what is useful, right? This is what Benedict was warning against, right? If the measure of truth is just what is useful, well, we need to ask the question, useful how? Useful to whom? Right? Useful for what and to whom? And we know that some of the answers that we would get to questions like that are going to disturb us. Okay? I just learned the other day, I'm a little bit behind the times. My nose is in spreadsheets maybe more than I would prefer, so I'm not quite up to date all the time. But I was just told by a close friend of mine about this new book, Cobalt Red. Have you heard of this thing, Cobalt Red? It's a bestseller that was published in January. It's about slavery in the Congo today in cobalt mining. And it's an interesting example of how a secular culture that puts truth aside and pursues utility ends up in very dark places, because it turns out cobalt is absolutely necessary for electric vehicle batteries. Okay, so what the whole electric vehicle thing purports to be good for the environment, and thus in some sense good for people, but the industry that's producing these batteries is apparently deeply implicated in human slavery. So, that's a contemporary example. All right, so this papal warning that if we don't pursue truth, we're just going to pursue usefulness. This papal warning echoed his earlier address to the University of Regensburg, in which he'd spoken of the tendency of modern inquiry, modern scientific inquiry, philosophical inquiry, to limit itself to the consideration of, quote, nature's capacity to be exploited for our purposes, which in turn leads to the assumption that, quote, only verification or falsification through experiments can yield decisive certainty. Close quotation. Now, such a positivist conception of the limits of human knowledge, the claim that we can truly know only what can be established by experiments, leads to a premature closure of inquiry and to a tragic narrowing of our view of the world, right? Can I find the soul on an X-ray machine? Can I measure justice or prudence in a balance? What's the wavelength of light that goes together with humility? No, right? We can't. Experiments aren't going to show us spiritual goods. Okay? So if we say that we can only truly know what can be established through experiments, we are narrowing our conception of what can be known. Pope Benedict explained, I quote, "If science as a whole is this and this alone, then it is man himself who ends up being reduced. For the specifically human questions about our origin and destiny, the questions raised by religion and ethics have no place within the purview of collective reason defined by science, so understood, and must thus be relegated to the realm of the subjective." Close quotation. Such an inhumane science we are seeing today in the spread of techniques that mutilate organs and change hormonal balances in the service of what is called sex reassignment. The tragic effects of these techniques on the health and the character and the lives of men, women, and children are steadily becoming better known and more widely decried. 12 years ago, when he spoke before the German parliament, Benedict XVI didn't feel the need to mention sex reassignment surgeries by name, right? As we know, it's really only been the last 3 or 4 years that this sort of thing has been headline grabbing, right? What he did in 2011 before the German parliament was point to how positivist stories lead us to self-deception. Okay, they create a climate of self-deception. I quote, "In its self-proclaimed exclusivity, the positivist reason, which recognizes nothing beyond mere functionality." Okay, so again, he's talking about a science or an approach to truth that is limited by what we can learn from experiments, from material experiments. Right? Positivist reason, which recognizes nothing beyond mere functionality, resembles a concrete bunker with no windows, in which we ourselves provide lighting and atmospheric conditions, being no longer willing to obtain either from God's wide world. Positivist reason is like closing ourselves in a bomb shelter. Okay? I'm old enough to remember bomb shelters. Okay? I was a kid in the 1970s, and we still had those drills where you went down into those bomb shelters, okay, back in the good old days of the Cold War. Benedict, okay, and yet, said the Holy Father, we cannot hide from ourselves the fact that even in this artificial world, we are still covertly drawing upon God's raw materials, which we refashion into our own products. The windows must be flung open again. We must see the wide world, the sky and the earth once more, and learn to make proper use of all of this. Okay? So here he is in a very gentle, right? He was such a gentleman, right? This white-haired old man, kind of diminutive, spoke very gently and very, very mildly, right? You know, we're kidding ourselves. We're saying that we're in charge and that we're creating a new world here. But the whole time we're doing this, we're drawing upon a world that we did not create in order to get the raw materials that we then manipulate. Okay? A very gentle but direct attack on the programs that we're seeing unfolding today. Now, it's not the case that we recognize a man as a man and a woman as a woman because of our faith. Okay? No. A man is a man and a woman is a woman because of what is recognizably the case. Okay? Even if we've got to dig into the chromosomes and find out whether there's a Y chromosome in there. Okay? It's nature that declares the sex of the person. Okay? What is it that faith does here? Faith steadies us in our resolve to stand by reason. Okay? To stand by what nature declares and what the intellect recognizes. Okay? By taking on this role of encouraging Christians, in the first place, to use reason appropriately, Benedict XVI was, again, following in the program of John Paul II. This is the program of Fides et Ratio. When Fides et Ratio was published in 1998, Faith and Reason, the encyclical of John Paul II, which Cardinal Ratzinger helped to write, Cardinal Ratzinger summed up that encyclical in 1999 in these terms. The encyclical is quite simply trying to give us courage for the adventure of truth. Courage for the adventure of truth. Okay? And this is what he's doing in his pontificate. Well, this message of encouragement, okay, is needed inside the church, right? So he's gone on attack against the unreality and self-deception of a self-limiting conception of reason to what can be known by experiments. Now he's turning his attention to the church. The church needs to be encouraged to use reason. Many Christians today are either intimidated by the self-confidence of representatives of secular culture, or they take the secular consensus as a starting point for their own reflection on the Christian faith, or in some cases, they abandon their faith altogether in favor of secular claims. Okay. Benedict XVI confronted this tendency, or these tendencies, in his Regensburg address in 2006, tracing it to what he called the, quote, liberal theology of the turn of the 20th century and the Protestant theologian Adolf von Harnack, who died in 1930. Harnack's central idea, the Pope said, was to return simply to the man Jesus and his simple message, which was to be extracted from the so-called accretions of theology. Right, so liberal Protestant theology of the turn of the 20th century, Adolf von Harnack, we're going to get back to the basic message of Jesus and prune away all these centuries of church teaching. What followed from Harnack's approach was that faith was reduced to a moral code, the content of which made liberal Protestant Christianity indistinguishable from the progressive political programs of the day. A century later, the situation is markedly worse, as many Christians in the West, both Protestant or Catholic, are viewing their faith as merely a cultural inheritance. Why am I Christian? Well, my parents were Christians, so I'm a Christian. Why am I Catholic? Well, I'm Polish. To be Polish is to be Catholic, so I'm Catholic. Okay. Here's how Benedict XVI summed up the situation in 2011. I quote, "It often happens that Christians are more concerned for the social, cultural, and political consequences of their commitment and think of faith as a self-evident presupposition for life in society." Okay. Now, he could sometimes speak in a way that was a little bit opaque. Okay. He's usually very, very clear. This is one of his more slightly opaque statements here. Some Christians today think of their faith as a cultural inheritance that is somehow self-evidently a part of what it means to be a good member of society. Okay? To be Christian, then, is to be a good person. Okay? Or nice. Right? This is what Benedict was identifying in 2011. Well, such Christians, of course, as we know, we're related to people like this. Okay? They're our neighbors. They may be our fellow parishioners. There are north of 72 million self-identified Catholics in the United States, but maybe 1 in 6 go to Mass regularly. Okay? But the remaining 5 in 6, they continue to call themselves Catholics. Same thing in the Protestant world, right? Lots and lots of American Protestants in terms of self-identification. 10s and 20s and hundreds of millions, well, not hundreds of millions, but well over 100 million. Okay? How many of them go to church every Sunday? Relatively few, but they still call themselves Christians. Okay? These Christians, of course, who aren't observing the faith, but still are identifying as Christians, don't particularly live like Christians. They conform to the standard secular way of living and thinking. Okay? And this is the challenge here, is that the challenge that Benedict was addressing in his Regensburg address is to re-propose the truth of the faith to these people for whom the faith has become nothing more than a cultural inheritance. Okay. Such a version of Christianity is a tragic falling short of what God intends. Right? It was the Lord himself who told Pilate, "For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I've come into the world, to bear witness to the truth." And to each of us, Jesus says, "If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Okay? If there's truth, then there are propositions that can express that truth. And there are contradictory propositions which are false. Okay? So if there's truth, there's the possibility of contradiction. If there's truth, there's going to be that sword dividing, mother from child and sister from brother and so forth. But it's the truth that actually sets us free and shows us the way to walk. Right? And you all are here this morning, of course, because you embrace this. You're grateful for the truth that Jesus brought into the world. But we need to recognize that within the church, we've got work to do. We need to stir up one another to be faithful to the truth. As I presume you know, just recently we've been presented with the disedifying spectacle of a cardinal archbishop dissenting from the church's teaching on human sexuality on the plea that, quote, "the sociological scientific foundation of this teaching is no longer correct," close quotation. It is appalling that a priest of Jesus Christ should appeal to one of the most dubious fields of study today, sociology. I mean, this is absurd. Okay? There's no such thing as a reputable consensus in the field of sociology. Okay? Okay? That a priest of Jesus Christ should appeal to sociology against what reason declares, what the church has always taught, and what in fact is also confirmed by divine revelation, is astonishing. But we should not be surprised. Because in an age when, as it were, globally, faith by many, by millions, is taken to be a mere birthright, and membership in the church, something that makes us nice or gives us a kind of sentiment of being civically minded or progressive or something. In an age characterized like this, we should not expect to find a lot of clarity about the truth commitments that follow from a commitment to the creed, to the truth of the creed. Okay? Well, Pope Benedict, knowing that there were within the church men and women of shaky or scant faith, responded by proclaiming a year of faith for the period October 11th, 2022 through November 24th, 2013. It was midway through that year of faith that he resigned. Okay? During that year of faith, he wrote the draft of what was subsequently published under Francis's name as the encyclical The Light of Faith, Lumen Fidei, and he also gave a series of general audience addresses on the subject of faith, which are very stirring, and they're a little bit more punchy than the subsequent encyclical, which is more of a kind of meditative document. In some of these general audience addresses, he goes straight at the problems of the day, both outside the church and inside the church. And I want to look at, on the back end of the handout here, this long selection here from his general audience address, What is Faith? Despite the greatness of scientific discoveries and technological triumphs, human beings today do not seem to become truly any freer or more human. So many forms of exploitation, manipulation, violence, abuse, and injustice endure. A certain kind of culture, moreover, has taught people to move solely within the horizon of things, of the feasible, to believe only in what they can see and touch with their own hands. Right? That's the positivist self-limitation of reason that he's contending against here. Yet the number of those who feel bewildered is also growing. And they are searching to go beyond a merely horizontal view of reality. These people are prepared to believe in everything and nothing. Okay, so on the one hand, we're seeing a tremendous rise of the New Age with outright demon worship in certain instances, okay? But we're also seeing, in an astonishing way, people continuing to convert and become Catholics. Okay, the church is not putting her best foot forward these days, but converts still come. It's amazing because they know they're going to meet the Lord in the church. Okay, this is what Benedict is referring to here. People are bewildered in the secular culture, but they're still looking for truth. In this context, certain fundamental questions reemerge that are far weightier than they seem at first sight. What is life's meaning? Is there a future for humanity, for us and for the generations to come? In which direction should we orient our free decisions for a good and successful outcome in life? What awaits us beyond the threshold of death? From these irrepressible questions, it becomes clear how the world of planning, of precise calculation, and of experimentation, in a word, the knowledge of science, although important for human life, is not enough on its own. We do not only need bread. We need love, meaning, and hope, a sound foundation, a solid terrain that helps us to live with an authentic meaning, even in times of crisis, in darkness, in difficulty, and with our daily problems. This is magnificent stuff here, okay? If I can gloss it, all right? It's never okay to say that the Christian faith is something that we just inherit. You know, my parents gave it to me. Or I'm Italian, so I'm a Catholic, or something like this, right? No. The Christian faith is a gift to every human being on the planet, precisely in the deepest part of our souls, right? In our ability to know and to love, all the way down at the bottom of our souls, right? From which emerge these irrepressible questions. What is the meaning of life? What happens to me after I die? Right? And there are other questions besides, but these are good ones. Okay? Right? And what the Holy Father was saying here is, of course, right? The faith is the answer to these questions. And we have to remember always to present the faith as the answer to these questions. So it's not just a culture, it's not just an inheritance. It's not just the faith is beautiful. There's all kinds of here it is, Easter, thanks be to God, a Gloria 8 days in a row, lots of candles. We could sing the Regina Caeli, right? There is a culture, this is all wonderful, right? We're named after saints. We got to eat meat last night for dinner. Meat Friday, okay? The faith brings a culture with it, but it's always deeper than that. It's always something so precious, right? Now, faith, of course, the theological virtue of faith is more than just an answer to questions, right? Most of us receive the grace of faith at our baptism when we're infants, of course, but it's the beginnings of friendship with God is what faith is. It's the beginning of a relationship with God, which is more than just an answer to questions. But it's at least an answer to questions. It's at least that, and it has to be that. And Benedict was reminding the church of how important this is. Okay, well, you all are an excellent audience here, but I can see if I keep going at the same pace, there'll be no time for Q&A. So I'm going to have to deal with hope and charity a little bit more crisply, okay? But it's okay because faith is the door. It's good to spend a lot of time on faith because faith is the door through which we can understand hope and charity, right? Faith is our response to God breaking into the world and revealing himself in ancient times through the prophets and in these latter days through his Son, okay? Hope, right, is our disposition to seek our happiness in God, right? In the God who we cannot see in this life. In the God who in this life we are only imperfectly united to. In the God who to enjoy, fully, soundly, perfectly, we first have to pay Adam's debt and die. Okay? Right? So hope is a disposition to seek our happiness in the life of the world to come. A secular society is, by its nature, opposed to Christian hope. Right? The word secular comes from the Latin root secula, which means the age. Okay, and it's a very appropriate adjective, secular. It means we attend only to this time, this earthly time. A secular society is one that does not pin its hopes on the life of the world to come or on eternal salvation, but instead it pins its hopes on something else. On what? Well, as Benedict XVI put it, on progress. Right? What kind of progress? Well, material progress. Progress through science understood as the means of manipulating the natural world. Not science fully understood as our entry into a knowledge of the being of things, but which is what it is, and it's a glorious thing. Okay. I'm kind of into ornithology myself, but other people are into neutron stars, and there's a lot of it out there. Science is great. Okay, not science understood as pursuing knowledge, but science understood as technique. Okay, it's science understood as technique that gives us the ability to manipulate the world and to have microwave pancakes or whatever else it is we're looking for. Okay. So here's Benedict XVI in Spe Salvi going on the attack. Going on the attack. Okay? Up to the Renaissance, the recovery of what man had lost through the expulsion from paradise was expected from faith in Jesus Christ. Here lay redemption. Now, that is from the 17th century, in certain particular cultural settings, of course, today it's the dominant culture, right? Now, this redemption, the restoration of the lost paradise, is no longer expected from faith, but from the newly discovered link between science and praxis. Or praxis here is a nasty Greek word turned into barbarous English that just means doing things, okay? The union of science and action, or doing things. This programmatic vision has determined the trajectory of modern times. Hope has acquired a new form. Now it is called faith in progress. Hope has acquired a new form. Now it's called faith in progress. Benedict XVI, Spe Salvi. What does that faith in progress look like? Well, we can see it in the works of Francis Bacon or René Descartes. It's most clear to my mind, in the late 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Many of you maybe have suffered through a modern philosophy class where you had to crack your teeth on Kant. He's very hard to read. There's a paragraph of Kant here. When the Easter season is over, you can read it. Okay. I'm gonna gesture towards it. Okay. Kant, in this particular paragraph, in the work from which it's drawn, has in common an aim with Machiavelli and David Hume and Karl Marx and various other modern thinkers. And it's that the goal here is to to delineate a science of man. Okay? And it's a very simple goal, right? Right? Think about it. Most of us in the room here are parents. Some of us, of course, are exercising spiritual fatherhood. God bless you, fathers, or spiritual motherhood. God bless you, sisters. Okay? If we've, or perhaps we're an older sibling or something like this, right? If you've ever tried to parent a child or to direct another human being towards his or her good, you realize that really the only tools we have are words that come out of our mouths, right? I mean, with the tiny little kids, you can kind of pick them up and move them, right? But with bigger people, right, what do we got, right? We got words, okay? And how do we deploy those words? Well, we try to establish some sort of bridge with the audience, right? With the wayward child or the employee or the friend or something. We try to communicate some relevant portion of what is true about the good to this person in a way that's sufficiently persuasive as to motivate this person to change his or her behavior. Okay? What would you say, in general, our success rate is in doing this sort of thing? Right? Are we batting 400? Okay? No. Okay? So this is the human problem, is that human beings can be moved, in the last analysis, by words, okay, by appeals to the good, and yet they stubbornly resist being so moved. Okay? So for Kant, Machiavelli, Marx, others, the bright idea is, well, let's just get around all that. And let's not appeal to words, and let's not deal with people as free choosers, but let's find some other lever inside human nature and pull on it so that we can get them to do what we want them to do. Okay? And for Kant, speaking in the idiom of late 18th century European science, it's attraction and repulsion. Because everybody was, think about Ben Franklin and so forth. Everybody's really into electricity and magnetism back then. So that was the controlling metaphor, right? For Marx, half a century later, as those of you know who studied some Marx, right, the controlling metaphor is the steam engine. It's all about pressure and explosions, okay? So the necessary revolution that's going to lead to the proletarian paradise and so forth, right? But the point is that what these Enlightenment thinkers do is they try to find some lever in human nature that doesn't involve appealing to people's freedom, pull it, and thus change the world, okay? Benedict is responding to this quest for a social science, right? Science in the strong sense, right? In Spe Salvi and in Deus Caritas Est and in Caritas in Veritate. And in each one of these documents, what he says is, any attempt to better the human condition that sets aside human freedom leads to tragic results. Okay, I paraphrase, but, and he had a one-liner here that was really a zinger, in which he said, where is it? Here. When we pursue these plans for progress through the social scientific manipulation of human beings in large groups, okay? I quote from Deus Caritas Est, people of the present are sacrificed to the Moloch of the future, a future whose effective realization is at best doubtful. Okay? People of the present are always sacrificed to the Moloch, the demon of the future. Okay, a very targeted strike. Okay. As far as charity is concerned, right, if reason has been limited to what can be measured, but human freedom and the terms that we use to describe human freedom, terms like the good or virtue, the words that we use to describe the virtues of character, those stable dispositions from which we choose the good, words like justice and prudence and temperance and courage, words like faith, hope, and charity. If all this is not scientific, right, then we've lost the human there. If our first principle here is that we're secular and that all of our striving is to change this world, and we're setting aside any possibility of a life after death, of a life of the world to come, of a life of friendship with God in eternity, and we're restricting ourselves to this world, right? And this is the secular mindset. Just how good are we going to be at loving our neighbor? Okay? Just how good a job are we going to do loving our neighbor in that, if we've done that? Okay? So when Benedict speaks about charity, right, he has a number of different strategies to poke at the prevailing secular consensus, okay? So he pokes at the tendency to offload real human charity to government agencies. And he makes it clear that, when people are suffering, they don't want a program, they want a person, okay? So he does a nice job with that, right? He does a nice job showing that when so-called charitable endeavors are in the pursuit of some this worldly secular aim, they often fall short with respect to justice, okay? And there's too many examples of that in the 20th century to need to enumerate them, okay? But this is the whole point of the various socialist or communist movements, not lowercase s socialism, but the real deal, you know, with all the gulags and all the rest of it. The offenses against justice are too many to count, right? There is no improving the human condition without maintaining justice, okay? And then finally, with a zinger, he responds to the contemporary distortions of charity by simply saying, as a good father, love is not a sentiment, okay? And this is, of course, you know, what's dominant in our culture is what passes for charity is just some sort of sentimental project of one kind or another. How does he promote hope and charity? Just very briefly, and we can talk more about his positive program for hope and charity in the Q&A here. Human character, virtuous character. Okay. What really makes the world a better place? Men and women of integrity, acting with generosity for the good of others. That's what makes the world a better place, right? So, right, I mean, obviously, hope for a Christian has as its horizon the life of the world to come, but the way of salvation is the same as the way of sanctification. And so that building up of good character, that living lives of hope and charity, is both for the sake of eternal life, and it makes this world better, okay? What makes this world better? Men and women of character serving their brothers and sisters, right? And, well, that just is charity, right? So in both cases, it's character that comes first. How did Benedict address that in his pontificate? In a beautiful, sustained, patient, understated way. For 4 years, almost every Wednesday, he gave a general audience address on a saint. It's been published in 4 volumes by Ignatius Press and Our Sunday Visitor and so forth. They're all available on the Vatican website. He starts with Jesus and the apostles, and he works his way all the way to the 20th century, talking about just about every major saint that you can point at, and lots of saints that most of us have never heard of. And it was a beautiful, humble, catechetical endeavor. Let's look at this real human excellence and that real human excellence. And this hidden follower of Christ, changing the world and making it a better place, and this hidden person, and so on, right? So for instance, one of my absolute favorite of these general audience addresses is a saint that probably 4 of you have heard of, Saint Joseph Cafasso. Anybody? Saint Joseph Cafasso, good. Okay, 3, okay, so it's good, okay. Saint Joseph Cafasso was the mentor and spiritual father for Saint John Bosco. And Saint John Bosco attributed the sort of trajectory of his own priestly life to the mentorship of Saint Joseph Cafasso. And when Benedict XVI wrote his little mini, these are like 1,200 words, these little audience addresses. So this mini talk on Joseph Cafasso, he made one really beautiful point, right? And it went like this. Here's the good teacher, right, pouring himself into his student, but refraining from imposing his own personality on that student, right? This is the good teacher, right? To draw forth what God has put in the heart of the student without himself, the teacher, getting in the way, okay? As a teacher myself, I've really treasured that general audience address, and I try to live by it in my own work, okay? And he did 144 of these general audience addresses on the saints, with another 20 dedicated to St. Paul on top of that. Why? Because this is how it's in the lives of Christians that we see faith, hope, and charity, that we see the world being transformed by God's grace, and that we find evidence of real progress and real brotherhood of man. Okay? All right. So, in conclusion, before we take a break here and we can get practical and talk about what follows from these principles here, right? Here's my 2 cents worth. One man's take on a very excellent pontificate, an 8-year-long pontificate, is that this high-flying theologian pope dedicated 8 years to clarifying our understanding of the 3 great goods, the 3 essential goods of Christian life, faith, hope, and charity, so that we have a true understanding of what faith, hope, and charity are, and how these mysterious realities, which are, these are the words we use to talk about what happens to a human being who is, experiencing the indwelling of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Okay? This is what happens to the human intellect and will from the life of grace, from friendship with God. Okay? To explain how faith, hope, and charity are different and have different effects from the mindset that dominates a secular culture and from the patterns of living that dominate in a secular culture. Okay? I think that was his task. I think he did it well. Thank you.